This is lecture 12 now, and I always like to talk a little bit about the use of animals in behavioral neuroscience research. I think that a lot of what you're going to be reading about in the book, as well as the research that we'll be talking about in the lectures, is work that's done with animals, and I think that it's worth spending, a little bit of time, talking about this and making sure that you have at least thought about the perspective of animal use in research. It's an important topic, and I find it's one that students oftentimes don't really think too much about until they're actually confronted with the fact that a lot of research that goes on in this field is research that has to utilize animals for research. So we're going to talk about this a little bit today. The use of animals in research, in behavioral neuroscience research, indeed in all scientific research, we can take a look at a number of different sources for conducting scientific research. Certainly, there's computer simulations and virtual reality, which I think is being used more and more, so that we don't have to necessarily use animals in research. And this certainly has value, and I think it is something that is probably increasing, not just in behavioral neuroscience, but in other areas, other scientific areas. There's physical simulations as well, in which we use artificial tissues and organs. This certainly has value, but at the same time, it's difficult to use such simulations in the case of behavioral work. So I think physical simulations are something that can be done in other areas of science. It's not something that can really be done all that much in the case of the study of behavior. There's also in vitro models in which we're studying cellular processes, cell cultures in petri dishes. That's certainly another valuable area of doing research that does not necessarily involve animals. But this presents its own ethical problems when we take a look at the sources of those cell cultures that we use. There's also human volunteers, and again, that is obviously highly controversial and ethically questionable as an alternative to animals. Not something that there's a good deal of research that goes on in the case of humans, but certainly any kind of invasive research is not something that would be deemed to be ethically responsible. And then there's this whole idea of an organism on a chip in which we can model the way in which different drugs, for example, different medicines, how they react in those more complex models that are used in the field of medicine. So there are alternatives, but a lot of times those alternatives are ones that are ones that we would have questions about in terms of ethics. When you take a look at the use of animals in research, and again, I want to confine myself to the United States, but I suspect that this is very similar in other areas of the world and other regions. But if you take a look at the utilization of animals in research in the United States, on an annual basis, take a look at this. Hamsters and guinea pigs, roughly 271,000 in a year. Rabbits are around 138,000. Other animals, gerbils, bats, ferrets, chinchillas, around 130,000. take a look at farmed animals, 84,000, non-human primates, about 62,000, dogs, 61,000, cats, 19,000. These are all animals that are covered by what is called the Animal Welfare Act. And you can see that this really represents a very small percentage of the total number of animals that are used in research, at least here in the United States. When you take a look at rats and mice and fish and birds and insects and invertebrates, that's about 20 million or more in the United States. You can see that these are animals that really are not covered by what's called the Animal Welfare Act. So there's a substantial degree of difference here in terms of these animals that are used and that are specifically covered by the Animal Welfare Act versus those that are not covered by the Animal Welfare Act that you see right here. So this is data that I think is important for you to reflect upon. When you take a look at what percentage of your genes you share. And again, if we take a look at plants, we take a look at yeast, fruit flies, the mouse, the chimpanzee. I think this is an interesting question, and I think that the answers to some of this might prove to be the things that maybe are a little bit surprising to you. For example, we share about 18% of our genes with plants, about 26% in the case of yeast. Fruit flies, we share about 44% of our genes in the mouse, about 92% in the chimpanzee, 98%. That's obviously our closest relative. So again, we share a good many genes with other animals, especially those animals that are used widely in terms of research in the field of behavioral neuroscience. The use of animals in behavioral neuroscience research has become a very, very important source of information. Obviously, your textbook that you're reading, as well as the lectures that we have for this course, represents a wide array, a great diversity of experiments with many, many different animals. But it is a controversial topic. It is one that I think has become even more controversial in the last 20 or 30 years, and a lot of it has to do with the amount of pain and discomfort that is being caused to animals. And certainly this is something that any researcher cares about, that any researcher is concerned about, because we want to try to minimize that as much as possible. So the reasons for using animals then, again, if you go back to some of those earlier slides, we share a lot of genes with other animals. And to the extent that you believe in phylogenetic continuity, that what we see in the case of lower animals is something that's probably represented as well in the case of human beings, then we want to know about what those underlying mechanisms are and whether or not they're similar to what we see in other animals. So it's easier oftentimes to do research in non-human species. We're also interested in animals for their own sake. We want to try to improve their lives as well, whether they're living in captivity or they're living in the wild. And that research is really going to help us to understand the human evolution process. Clearly, there are animals, there's research that cannot be done in human beings because of legal or ethical reasons. And that is why oftentimes we resort to using animals in behavioral neuroscience research. So if you take a look at the general organization, the general plan of the brain for all mammals, if you take a look at this diagram that you see here, here's the rat brain and the distribution of the important areas of the brain, the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. Here's the cat. Again, take a look at the distribution of these brain areas, quite similar to what you see in the rat. Take a look at the monkey. Again, take a look at the distribution of the brain areas. Take a look at how similar they are, and then take a look at the human being. And you have, again, that very strong similarity in terms of the organization of the brain and in the case of mammals. So even though the size of the brain is changing, certainly we have, by virtue of natural selection, much larger forebrain. The basic areas, the basic organization of the brain is similar amongst these different mammals. So that in and of itself, I think, is very important to reflect upon, because that is why we choose to study lower animals, because their brains are so similar to that of the human being. There's been opposition to the use of animals that's in research that I think has been a part of scientific research for a very long period of time. In this day and age, it can really be broken down into two different areas, what we call minimalists. These are individuals who do believe in the value of research, but they want to make sure that proper controls are in place in order to minimize pain and suffering. Very strong consideration about the type of animal that's used and the amount of stress that they're exposed to. But nonetheless, they believe in the value of research. And then there's abolitionists. And those are individuals who believe that the use of animals should not be a part of scientific research at all. That animals have the same rights as humans, and any utilization of animals is unethical. This is an extreme view. It is one that is represented in a number of different organizations and groups like PETA, for example, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. You're increasingly seeing more of extreme views here, and to the point where some individuals that belong to these extremist groups actually favor breaking into laboratories and releasing animals that have been oftentimes used in research that has become very valuable for understanding human behavior and for understanding the development of vaccines and the development of medicines that are life-saving. So again, we have these two opposition groups, minimal abolitionists. There's important considerations in the approval of animal research, and it has to do with how much distress, how much discomfort is being caused. And quite frankly, there's no clear dividing line that exists here. It is one that is assessed on a case-by-case basis by what are called institutional animal care and use committees that you see in every institution. Now, I'm talking primarily about what happens here in the United States, but in many other countries, they have a similar kind of mechanism. That is, there are professional guidelines, ones that are maintained by scientific societies, for example, ones that are maintained by government agencies. But here in the United States, on most college campuses, this organization, which is called IACOC, Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, they oversee and determine what procedures are acceptable and which ones are not. And again, a lot of this is related to professional guidelines, government imposed guidelines that they are obligated to consider. In most colleges and universities, those committees consist of scientists. They consist of people that are drawn from many different parts of the university, who are not necessarily involved in doing any kind of animal research. They also involve people outside the community, who have nothing to do with the university whatsoever. So they, on a case-by-case basis, then review the research protocols that scientists submit every time that they want to do a new piece of research. And those submissions are very detailed in terms of justifying the type of animal that is used, the number of animals that are used, the amount of discomfort that they are exposed to. It is a quite lengthy bureaucratic process that is involved with the primary goal of protecting the animals that are used in scientific research. So again, the question, should animals be used in research? There are many believe that they should, because they have played an important role in understanding the human condition and the animal condition. There are people who say yes, because of the fact that there are such elaborate guidelines that we have, federal regulations, professional guidelines that are all there to protect animals. And they would say that by and large, society has made a judgment that this is something that benefits the public. Animal research, the benefits of it outweigh any of the costs that may be involved. And lastly, those who are advocates of utilizing animals in research say that they've played a pivotal role, really, in helping us to have a society in which we are able to research important problems that have to do with healthcare, whether it be mental health care or physical health care. But we need to treat animals responsibly, and we need to treat them well. So there's this recognition then that this research is important, that this research with animals is something that should continue, that it is research that is really instrumental for improving the lives of the human species, and indeed of helping us to have healthy living and healthy way of treating individuals who may be suffering from various types of unwanted diseases or unwanted physical conditions, disorders, mental disorders. And so again, this is something that many people certainly do advocate, but there are also people on the other side of things who say that animals should not be used in research. And a lot of this comes down, I think, to the thought by some individuals that animals have basic rights too, and that why should human beings be in a place to judge? Why are they in a position of making these moral kinds of distinctions? I mean, this is something that we refer to as speciesism. And so there are individuals then who believe strongly that this research with animals simply shouldn't be done. There are many species that are not covered by the Animal Welfare Act, as I noted to you earlier, so there's very strong opposition to this as well. And lastly, excuse me, the benefits of animal research are uncertain. I mean, that's why we do the research. We don't know what the outcome is going to be, and that's why we propose an experiment. But those who believe that research with animals should not continue say that the cost to the animal is real. And that cost usually results in the demise of the animal, that once the experiment is done, the animals in many cases are sacrificed to examine them in terms of their biochemistry, for example. This being the area of behavioral neuroscience, that oftentimes is what is done. So these are, very important considerations, and there's a number of thought questions that you have in the syllabus that you should give some thought to, whether or not, what side of the issue you stand on here. I think it's important for you to reflect upon that. And those are things that we will discuss in some of our discussions that we will have associated with this lecture.